Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We at Virtual Fourth Space are very delighted to welcome you to this interdisciplinary group of panelists who will introduce themselves shortly, our moderator and our webinar attendees for a conversation that affects us all during this uncertain time. We are thrilled that today's moderator, Dr. Anne-Marie Croteau, Dean of the John Molson School of Business and Professor in Supply Chain and Business Technology Management, will guide today's conversation and encourage you to participate via the webinar Q&A option. Those of you who are following along on Facebook, your comments will also be addressed throughout the next hour. So without further delay, I hand it over to you, Anne-Marie, to introduce today's conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. It is a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. It's an important conversation that we want to have around the economic futures in business and the arts. We have an extremely talented and capable and list of experts who are gonna join us for this. And without further ado, I'd like to proceed and ask each of them to introduce themselves. So I will start with Moshe Lander. Please introduce yourself.
Well, you gave away the key point. My name is Moshe Lander. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Economics. I've been appearing across Canadian media, TV, radio, television, podcast, the whole bit, commenting on the various economic aspects of the coronavirus and the damage that it's been doing to households, to businesses, some of the political and policy ramifications. And so that's what I'm bringing today, I guess.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Now I'd like to invite a dear colleague of mine, Stephen Applebaum, Professor of Management. Stephen?
Hi, I'm a professor of organizational behavior and human resource management. Been at Concordia for a long time. My areas that I've been researching have been stress, motivation, leadership, and organizational change. And I think that this current challenge ties into a great deal of research that I've been spending years on, and currently what's happening in the popular press. So I would like to talk about the leadership aspect of it when I get my chance to sort of comment on where we are and where I think we're going.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this. Now I'd like to invite another colleague from JMSB, Matthäus Tekathen. Matthäus?
Hello, everyone. I'm from Accountancy. My area of research is on organizational risk management. So basically the question of how do we manage risk? And often I get the question, what kind of risk are you interested in? Is it financials? Is it reputation risk? Cybercrime, disasters? Well, I'm interested in all of them, and more importantly about what approaches do we have as organization to manage these risks, to address them so that we get to where we want to go, to reach our objectives and avoid surprises along the way and embrace opportunities. And now we're in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we see how individuals, societies and organizations are responding to the risk, but also to the risk induced by the decision we make, like flattening the curve, confinement. So there's really a very topical topic for me today to talk about risk management. That's a bit of my background.
Thank you very much, Matthäus. And our last speaker, but not least, of course, Dr. Patrick Lowe, Associate Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Science. Patrick?
Hi, thank you. So I'm a professor of literature, but specialized in the performing arts. About 10 years ago, I became very keenly interested in the contemporary circus scene here in Quebec and have been following it very closely. And Professor Tekathen mentioned notions of risk. Well, circus is all about risk, controlled risk, trained risk, and yet here we are in a situation that no one could expect. And so I've been looking at the impacts of the current pandemic on the extremely complex circus ecosystem, which has large companies, multinational companies like Cirque du Soleil, and another 7 or so smaller companies that are experiencing it very differently.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So what I would suggest is that I ask each of you to, again, expand on what you briefly have explain to us of what your expertise is. And I'd like to restart with Moshe and ask him to tell us more about how you see the danger of moving too quickly, given what's going on. We know that the governments at many levels around the world are trying to contain the situation, but it's also the pressure of getting back on track with the economy that is extremely suffering right now. So could you give us your perspective on that factor and many others that you have in mind? Thank you.
Sure. So inherently, the question that I keep receiving from everybody is, how does this situation compare to previous recessions? How does it compare to the Depression? And the answer that I'm always going to give is that every recession is different. It's caused by something different. The sectors that are affected are different, and the recovery, when this one comes, is going to be different too. So the idea that we try and use history as some sort of guideline to what we're experiencing here is always problematic, because clearly we've never seen anything like this. The Spanish flu that happened a century ago was itself very different, even though it was a pandemic, even though it affected a large number of people with a large amount of people dying. The fact was that the world wasn't nearly as integrated as it is today. So there's not quite the analogy there. The Depression was also something global, but it was also different in that the nature of the economies were different. They were heavily into manufacturing and agriculture instead of capital goods and services, the way the current economy is. So it's very different. The crisis that we find ourselves in now is effectively creating a basic trade-off between the health of society's citizens and the economic well-being of those citizens. So there's a tension here that if you try and go too far in protecting the health of everybody, the way we're experiencing being locked down, quarantined, restricted travel, forced closure of businesses, that does flatten the curve faster than, say, it otherwise would, but it comes at great economic consequence. If you try and restart the economy without having dealt with the underlying problems of the virus itself, then you're effectively creating a trade-off here where to create economic activity, you're also putting people's lives at risk, or at greater risk than they already are. The number that I saw yesterday was that Canada finally passed 4,000 deaths. This is a huge number, but if you put it within the context of 40 million Canadians, 4,000 deaths is 1% of 1% of the population. This is a very, very small number. And so as provinces are racing to try and open things up, they're disregarding the fact that 99 100ths of 99% are still not showing any sort of fatal symptoms here. This is a politician's logic that, all right, we've had 7 weeks of lockdown, time's up. Let's just get back to business as usual and see what happens. I think what's happening here is that they haven't properly weighed the trade-offs. And what we're going to end up with is probably a second lockdown in the fall or winter again.
I have to unmute myself. There's also the risk of hospitals' capacity not being able to receive the people who are sick, right? So where do you fit that segment of hospital capacity in the equation right now?
Well, it's a supply and demand thing again. And so if hospitals are constrained by their supply of beds or ventilators or any other sort of life-saving devices or things that are going to make the virus, the curve flatten faster, if demand for those things exceeded, of course, usually the response would be that the price of this good is going to have to go up. But of course, in Canada, in our beloved free healthcare system, you can't start charging people to show up. Even if you did have a for-pay system, it would be fundamentally immoral and wrong to charge people to go be treated for coronavirus. So the problem that the healthcare system is facing is that if there's an overwhelming demand for health services, they're going to have to start making life and death decisions basically about who is going to receive, say, intubation and who isn't, who's going to receive life-saving ventilator support and who's not. And so they're going to have to deal with kind of those fundamental supply and decisions that any other economic actor has to deal with. But in our case, the decision of, do we go to work or do we stay at home, or do we miss a mortgage payment, or do we put food on the table? When we have to make these sorts of trade-off decisions, the decisions that they're going to have to make are really much more fundamental, as who's going to live and who's going to die. The healthcare services will very much say that in this trade-off between the safety of its citizens and the economic recovery, side with safety until there is rapid and regular testing available, or even better, a vaccine that allows people to identify quickly who has this disease, get yourself locked down for 2 weeks. You don't have the disease, you can go about your life as usual. I'm saying disease, I should be saying virus, but semantics, I guess.
All right, well, thank you for this. You mentioned the government leaders. So we have an expert now on leadership. So I'd like to ask our colleague, Stephen, to tell us more about good and bad leadership, how he sees the situation, and so on. Stephen?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to take a broader view and then sort of move back into more of the specifics of actual leadership. There's a very different leadership style of leading through the pandemic than leading after the pandemic. So leading is not managing. Leading is really, how do you influence people? And the models are very similar in business or in politics. As an example, the current open office may be gone and probably replaced by an old-fashioned cubicle that will be reinforced with plexiglass for protection. So we won't be huddling together any longer and brainstorm. It's going to be on Zoom. So some of the issues that leaders have to deal with as who returns to work and in what capacity and who doesn't. How do we now design and develop succession plans equitably? So even as you create a new model for leadership, leadership is a very lonely occupation because you make decisions that you're not going to get buy-in all the time. Currently, many leaders use a transactional style, which is much more managerial, but that has to be converted over to transformational for the long run. So the new skill requirement for leaders will be, how do you manage the present from the future? So how do you move off into the future? The future used to be 3 years. The future can now be 2 months. How do you move off into the future, make decisions, come back to the present, and start doing things now as if you're in the future? That's what transformational management and leadership is all about. So transformational leaders, they're visionaries, they're charismatic, they're authentic. They take accountability for the things that they do right, and they but they have to take responsibility for the things that don't work. And we've seen this consistently with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. We've seen it to a certain degree with Justin Trudeau and Francois Legault. We have not seen anything close to this in the US. It's almost as if we're watching a show of The Apprentice. So to be a transformational leader, you have to have vision and trustworthiness. And we're looking for somebody who's dynamic, somebody who's upbeat, somebody who's proactive. And the cornerstones of this is a moral foundation that has not been apparent. And I'm looking at the US because it's on TV 24 hours a day, and that's the model we keep looking at. So what should leaders be doing during this pandemic? Well, the first thing is telling the truth. That's really crucial. Another one is keeping promises. Another one is being equitable and fair, and having respect for individuals and treating people with dignity. And the key to leadership is trust. If your followers don't believe in you, and if you get a different story each day, then you basically have no trust. And trust is based on integrity, your competence. Are you consistent day in and day out? Are you open? Are they getting the full story? If they believe that, you don't have to have great skills as a leader. You don't have to be romantic. You don't have to have panache. You have to do those things that people believe in you, and therefore your leadership is crucial as you're guiding people through uncharted waters that we've never been in before. So to look at leaders, political leaders, business leaders, this is basically the ingredients. I think that's so crucial. A little bit later, if I get a chance, I'll just give you a couple of lists of some research that just came out within the last month or so on looking at leaders that fail and leaders that are more successful. So I'll stop at this point.
Oh, I'm curious to know more though. Are you ready to go and move on? Because
stay tuned.
Okay, we'll do that. Now, I'd like to ask Matthäus about, you mentioned your interest for risk management as well as the response to any risk situation that we have. So how would you assess the current situation, or do you have any guidelines or things that we need to pay attention? So we'd like to hear your opinion on this.
Yes, so it's the, I don't want to start with this conceptual discussion. Is it crisis management or risk management? I think we were, maybe go back in March, it was definitely crisis management. Now I see it more with opening up more in between phase between crisis and risk management. But I want to, in the response to your question, bring it to more to an organizational level. So we have like this idea of two archetypes how to respond to crisis. One is the familiar crisis. Let's say we have a blackout in Quebec, and Hydro-Quebec knows right away how to solve it. They have their standard protocol. They follow the procedure, so they are well prepared for this. And then we have the other archetype, and of course there are a lot of colors in between these two archetypes. But the other archetype is maybe more what the COVID-19 pandemic is at the moment. We call it unprecedented, meaning, well, we are not so familiar with it. And here we cannot go back to our standard procedures. It's not our routine business. Of course, in response to the SARS crisis, I've seen organizations implementing business continuity planning, and also pandemic was one of the risk notion they were looking at. But now, of course, whether it's an abstract idea or really materialized, it's a different thing. So in this kind of setting, unprecedented crisis, emergency, here we need the different types of risk response. And this is more about learning while we are going, learning as we go. It's more about entrepreneurial thinking, adapting the business model to the new circumstance. And that's what I've seen, or that's what currently business owners and entrepreneurs are doing. We know businesses are closed, at least the non-essential businesses, but it doesn't mean that our business leaders are not working. They are working very hard on preparing the opening up. And Patrick, you mentioned Cirque du Soleil, and that's what they're currently doing. They're working on how can we go back, how can we open up our shows. So my picture on this is we have this one archetype of risk response, which is more of a routine response, which I think doesn't work so well at the moment. So we have to rather engage in critical thinking, problem solving. So rather an entrepreneurial approach, adaptive approach to finding solution to the problem. That is the first reflection.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. So Patrick would like to go back to your point about what happens right now with the Cirque du Soleil, but also by training, you can speak to us about lessons learned from the past. And there's maybe things that happened in the past that could maybe give us some ideas of what to expect in the future. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I'd like to know if there's something that we can learn from the past, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Especially from arts and culture perspective.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the performing arts, which obviously have to do with liveness. It has to do with people being in a room, in a space, under a tent, in a theater, together. And obviously under the context of any pandemic, we have to rethink this. How do you rethink liveness? Already, sure, there's virtual reality, we're doing various things online, but it remains a mediated liveness. So looking back historically, I guess the most famous impact of any plague or any pandemic on the performing arts would have been during Shakespeare's era. If you look at Shakespeare's plays, many of them carry a lot of subtext pertaining to the plague, but concretely between 1603 and 1613, theaters were closed 60% of the time because of the plague. This is an era in which, in a single year, 1606, London lost 10% of its population. And yet, as soon as they could, audiences went out. They didn't quite understand what, scientifically what the plague was about and where it was carried, et cetera. But this fundamental need, this fundamental desire to partake of something beyond themselves individually, basically drove them back to the theaters, which is, I guess from a public health perspective, not entirely reasonable, but from a psychological, emotional, and individual mental health perspective, it's a definite need. Antonin Artaud in the 1930s wrote about the, I guess more metaphorically, about the impact of thinking through theater in the plague, and he saw this basically in a, I guess, romantic perspective, but also seeking truthfulness, authenticity, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The plague, according to Artaud, was essentially something that affected organs that we can, to a certain extent, control: our brain, our lungs. The breath is all about the actor, the performing artist. You can control this, and therefore, thinking through the plague as a metaphor here basically allowed us to think about what's absolutely essential. What can we control? How can we adapt? If we're in a situation of organic disorder, how do you rethink the organs? How do you transform yourself in this context? And so, it might seem lofty, but concretely, we're seeing this in Quebec. We're seeing artists basically having to rethink the relationship to their art, the relationship to their body, the relationship to community. And I've got two research assistants who are basically charting every single initiative in contemporary circus here in Quebec. And we have 29 different types of initiatives. And within these initiatives, you've got, leaders. We were talking about leaders earlier, and I really appreciate what Professor Applebaum brought forth, especially the notion of keeping promises and treating people with dignity, being honest. You've got a few of those leaders online talking about what's happening, talking about their art, talking about the return, but also their current state. I'm thinking of Seven Fingers of the Hand, Les Sept Doigts de la Main. Two of the co-artistic directors were online speaking about this. You've got a professional organization called En Pace, and they're reaching out. They're creating weekly get-togethers for the community. They're giving free training because, as circus artists, you're only as good as your, not your last show, but your last performance. Excuse me. And your body basically has to be kept, absolutely in shape, in a state of readiness. We're not just shutting off machines. This is human beings who take risks, who could die in any given performance. They have to keep the motivation and the training to keep going. It's not always possible to do so. So this is affecting individuals, sure, in their sense of I guess, place in the world, but in their physical integrity also. So there's something deep rooted, I think, in terms of the effect of the pandemic on the performing arts. What will come out of this? What's possible? Do we just go online? Something new and interesting called net flips, flip like as in backflip. Netflix TV is offering circus performances, for rental. All these different things are coming out. Soleil is presenting a number of their shows, also their archive shows online. Same thing with Seven Fingers, etc. But there's also companies like Cirque Éloise that's doing balcony performances throughout Montreal to remind us that we are actually connected. There is liveness that's actually possible. We can communicate fundamentally through our bodies, through our presence, despite the pandemic.
That's very interesting. So we have to watch them and also encourage them as much as we can, right? It's part of our economy as well. And I'd like to go back to Moshe about the economic and the, from an economic perspective, if you see any new industries that are emerging or any new trends or ways of dealing together, given the situation. We have some very practical cases with the circus model, but you foresee something, or have you witnessed something from what's happening in Europe and so on? So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know if you're trying to be ironic by asking about new ideas and things like that, given that we're having a webinar on Zoom. Ask anybody 3 months ago, 6 months ago, did you know what Zoom was? Did you know how to use it? I think a lot of us have quickly learned. So, you know, the thing is that with any economic downturn, this is always the time when, in a sense, innovation is at its cheapest. You know, when the economy is riding high, being innovative gives you a tremendous amount to lose. It's the worst time to go bankrupt. It's the worst time to lose everything that you've invested in. But when all of us are sitting at home and we really have nothing to lose, this is the time when you can be innovative. And so I think my colleagues here at the Biz School, of course, will be well versed in the idea that Hewlett Packard, of course, was started in the Depression as just, well, what do we do while we're sitting around without a job? So, you know, these types of ideas are going to be what spurs kind of the middle part of the century. And so the people that recognize that, you know what, we have all of this technology available to us, and we probably haven't been even scratching the surface of what we can do with it. This is going to be the way that new industries arise. The idea of social distancing. I'll admit that 2 months ago in my classroom, I was using the phrase #social distance as a joke because I wasn't even taking this seriously. And I thought that this is just something that's going to blow over like a seasonal flu. So the idea of now social distancing, we've already heard comments made, I think Stephen mentioned the idea of how this is going to recreate the workspace in which we work. It's going to recreate the way that we interact with each other. I've been reading about the idea of Bluetooth being used as a way to try and create immediate contact, so that if somebody later comes and reveals that they have coronavirus, they can Apple and Google can tap into your Bluetooth and find out all of the people that you've come in, you know, within 2 meters of, and notify them. So this is going to change maybe the way that health is delivered. I had a reason that I needed a doctor during this lockdown. It wasn't virus related, but I needed a doctor, and I wasn't prepared to go to a walk-in clinic and expose myself to risk. Well, guess what? I come across an app that allows you to hook up with a Canadian doctor online for $50. They'll provide you with a diagnosis. Think of how that changes the healthcare system in terms of rural communities in Canada, and the access to specialists that otherwise wouldn't exist, or having to travel to the big city where now maybe they don't need to. We've seen education transformed in 2 short months, that all of us have had to learn how to deliver lectures, and this is going to continue through the summer, could even continue into the fall. So how's this going to shape the way that we educate ourselves, educate children, educate young adults, and deliver them with knowledge? All of a sudden now we're talking about maybe education doesn't have to be a 4-year degree where you give up that 18 to 22-year-old period. Maybe this is something where you can be educated over decades while you're simultaneously working, that maybe you take a day of the week where you go to Zoom lectures and you acquire technical skills, practical skills that can be reinforced back into the workplace. And so it's a completely revolutionary sort of way of thinking. And so this crisis, while it is, of course, a crisis, what's the phrase? Every crisis is an opportunity. And so there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here that if you're willing to take that risk, if you're willing to kind of be innovative and just see what's out there and not be afraid of the failure that comes with it. Kind of, I guess, ties into Patrick's idea that the people at the top of the pyramid, no pun intended, within kind of the circus industry, right? Their rise is through inherently taking risks that while they have to start off with ropes and things like that, they have to be unafraid to take that first leap and to do that maneuver that would otherwise be unexpected. And that's how you create the genius of the arts, is through being innovative. So I see that there's a tremendous upside here to the virus. It's just a matter of kind of how we condition ourselves to view it. And I guess that goes to Matthäus' point then about kind of the way that we want to manage that risk, that there's a certain element here of within the economic capacity of an economy to reinvent itself. This is the prime time.
True. And also you mentioned the capacity of the economy. We got a great question from the audience, which is, and it's for you, what do you think of the emergency funds, and what is it helping the economy, or what's the positive and the negative impact of those emergency funds?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of comment that's been put out there into the press about the dangers of excessive deficits and debt accumulation, especially at the government level, that are we posing some sort of long-term risk to society? And I would certainly push back and say that, when you have a patient that's dying, you usually don't ask too many questions. You do what's needed to get the patient through the crisis, and then you kind of worry about what are the ramifications. It's the same thing when you have an economy that's dying on the table. At this point, pumping cash into the economy is kind of that life-saving method, that in the absence of these spending plans, whether they're well conceived or ill conceived, the fact is that doing something at this point is clearly better than doing nothing. The thing about the debt is that politicians will try and present this to the voter as it's a bad thing because you as a citizen couldn't tolerate too much debt without pushing yourself into a financial risky situation. Governments are different. We can go bankrupt. Governments, generally speaking, don't. They have the nuclear option that they can print money. We don't. Unless you're in the counterfeiting game, it's not something that we have available to us. So, you have this ability then where if you absolutely need to, you can print your way out of this. It'll create inflation for sure. But again, that's something that we dealt with in the 1980s rather effectively. It's something that we can deal with again. And if that's what's needed, fine. The other point that I'd make too about the debt is, if I told you that, let's make up a number. Let's say that I have $500,000 worth of debt. If I asked anybody, are you worried about my ability to finance my debt? I'm sure the question that would come back will hopefully be, well, how much do you earn? If I tell you that, as a starving Concordia faculty member, I make a whopping $20,000 a year, and you would weep for my $500,000 and say, you're in tremendous difficulty, my friend. But if I told you that I'm a high-flying Concordia faculty member and I'm extremely valuable to the university and I make $500,000 a year, a $500,000 debt doesn't look so threatening then. So it's the same thing within the economy, that what matters is not the absolute value. The number that I've seen thrown out is that the government has spent $250 billion in this crisis so far. That's a huge number to me. I mean, it's more than I'm ever going to think of earning by a factor of a lot of zeros. But if I told you that the Canadian economy is $2 trillion, $250 billion doesn't look nearly as scary and nearly as significant. So in the grand scheme of things, the economy growing on the other end of this crisis is going to make that $250 billion look increasingly less and less significant. If that debt is being financed by our children, then it's something that we can sit around the table and tell them that, hey, listen, let me tell you about this crisis that we experienced in the early part of the 2020s. Yeah, we had to run up huge spending, and unfortunately, you, kiddo, are going to be the taxpayer that has to pay that back. But without that spending, you wouldn't be around now to pay it back. So there's kind of an intergenerational aspect too, that, you know what, it's scary, but it's what needs to be done. And there are lots of escape routes on the way through.
Thank you very much for this. Very interesting. So I'd like to go back to Stephen, who told us about the next phase of his explanation about the good and bad leadership, right, Stephen?
Just a minute. I have something before that Moshe just came up with, Anne-Marie.
Go ahead, please.
And I think he hit on something that's very important. what's happening right now is that employees, excuse me, are the most critical in solving the problems for these organizations. When we talk about leadership, leadership assumes that you have this great leader who's got all the answers, and they don't. So one leader is not as smart as N number of people who are working for them. So the key element is, how do you keep people engaged? You have to communicate, you got to communicate, and you have to communicate. So just as we're looking at new technologies with Moodle, Zoom, Yuja, and everything else, leaders have to learn the styles that are going to work right now in this pandemic. So this is really a managing change issue. And when we talk about change, we think about going from the problem to a brand new beginning. And that's a mistake. The problem we're in, we have to deal with the problem starting with ending the problem. So how do we deal with where we are right now? And how do we start moving to making certain alterations structurally, behaviorally, in our own style before we get to a new beginning? And the problem is that between the ending and the beginning is something called the neutral zone. And that's a very uncomfortable spot that we're going to be in for a very long time. So in the neutral zone, we get rid of the things that didn't work, and we start experimenting with some new structures, processes that we think may work, and we have to reward people for making mistakes, because this is really crucial. So if you don't engage and have those people who really understand how the organizations are working, part of this, they're not going to be part of the new beginning. So they must be involved completely as you're going through this. Now, the problem with leaders, many of them are, I really know everything. I have a great brain. I think I heard a couple of times on TV. You may have a great brain, but your one brain is not as good as 1,000 brains working in the organization who see it very, very differently. So maybe I can segue into what you asked me to do. Some research that just came out, and I thought was most interesting. What are some of the perceived problems that are seen by followers with today's current corporate leaders? This is people who are trying to manage things in a management style, but not in the leadership style. And these are some of the issues that they see in these people who are leading. Lack of morals and integrity, self-centeredness, narcissism, improper focus, not caring for workers' needs, greed, lack of communication, poor organizational skills, and lack of leadership skills. So we're assuming when we give somebody a title that they understand leadership. It doesn't happen that way, because leadership is really what's perceived in the eye of the people who you're leading. And if you do it right, they think you're a great leader. If you don't, you never, excuse me, you never get to that point. So what should transformational leaders be doing in the pandemic in terms of involving everybody? Well, they really have to be knowledgeable. They have to really take information from the scientists and run with it. Be aware and open-minded to any kind of changes that look reasonable. Lead by example. Be respectful of people. Be compassionate of their anxieties and fears. Leaders are just as anxiety-ridden as their followers. So it's okay to let people know that it really bothers you too. Ethical. Being fair and honest. Being driven and courageous. And the last one is being trustworthy. And I think as we're watching the news and we're looking at all of the blips that are going on south of the border, we don't see this. And I think that's crucial, because that's the model that we're looking at right now. Because in the US, when the elephant has a cold and sneezes, Canada gets sick. And I think that it's a leadership issue we're looking at right now, where we're pushing science and inclusion to the side for, I know how to do it by myself. No one is that smart. So I think that this is crucial, with the constant communication back to your people, what's going on, because they really want to know.
it confirms that a leader is always as strong as his or her team, right? So, and the importance of listening to what people have to say and to be very bottom up in your approach works better in such case like a pandemic, right?
Step two.
See too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now back to you, Matthäus, about how do you see the response that could come later on? If it's, I know we don't have a crystal ball, but from your perspective, how would you like to address or see our leaders address the economic future?
I think Moshe, he already gave great examples, summarizing this unfreezing capacity of entrepreneurial thinking, of experimenting and adapting to this new reality. If we go back, like opening up the economy, we have this distinction between essential business, non-essential business, and in this non-essential category, this prefix non is always a shorthand for big diversity, you know, because they're in this big box of non-essential business. We have some which are more in the which can work from home, from the distance, others more in the manufacturing world. They have to go into the factory. And so there it's about preparing for the relaunch. And we've seen, if you think about Olemi, the meat processing company, for example, here in Quebec, how they adapted their shop work space, the flow of people to make sure that these guidelines, keep 2 meters distance, etc., are followed. What I see from some, what I see as well is in the risk management system of organization is that new risk categories are emerging. They call it COVID-19 risk. But here, just as a word of caution, is that some are treating it more as a compliance risk. Oh, we have the government directives. You have to be 2 meters apart. You have to wash your hands, etc. But yes, it is this, but it's much more. It's not just a compliance thing, how we can work around or work with the pandemic. It's also more a strategic thing. How do we make our business model fit or COVID-proof, fit for other pandemics? And it's also about how serious do we take external risk, what is called external risk that we cannot as a single organization influence, like a pandemic, like other forms of disasters. And here it's more about getting ready, being preventive, being prepared, I mean. And I think the COVID-19 shifts much more focus to this third category, shifts focus away from treating risk management as a compliance exercise, but more as an entrepreneurial strategic matter, as well as how do we get prepared for external risk challenges. And here we can go back to Goldbright, how to design complex organization. Either you have enough buffer, or you increase your information processing capacity. Nowadays, you would call be agile and adaptive. And these are the two levers in which organization can now relaunch, or some of these two levers, how organization can now relaunch the business.
Well, thank you for this. And talking about relaunching a business, we have a question for Patrick from the audience, and we are curious to know what you think about the $50 million injection in Cirque du Soleil.
Right. I think it was absolutely essential and most welcome. So what was that injection? I guess I'll step back a tiny bit. So Cirque du Soleil is it's a massive, massive company. I don't think people realize last year they generated $950 million US, right? So this is almost $1 billion Canadian dollars coming into mostly Montreal. So the impact on our economy, all in basically the cultural industry at large, is extraordinary. The trickle-down effect, the economists will give you various numbers, but this is huge. So we're talking about 5,000 direct employees, 5,000 direct jobs, in addition to an entire ecosystem, as I mentioned before. So at least 2 other large companies, Seven Fingers and Cirque Éloise, and just in Montreal, another 40 or so companies, and then that are touring internationally. So this contrary to, for instance, theater, dance, or other highly subsidized performing arts. the circus has been actually very good at generating revenue through ticket sales. It hasn't relied on grants as much. And Cirque du Soleil, 5 years ago, 2015, basically was sold to external interests. So TPG in the US, Fosun in China, and the Caisse de Dépôt, so our collective investment, what we say in French are what's it called, the bas de laine, where we invest our funds. So this basically changed the dynamic. Money came in from the outside to help basically rebuild, restructure the company. And we're in a situation where most of the revenue generating the cash flow for the company came from ticket sales. 44 shows around the world. They had shows on cruise ships, they had shows in Asia, in Europe, South America, in Canada, as well as the 8 permanent venues, so Orlando and Las Vegas. So everything's fine as long as you've got this revenue coming in. And Daniel Lamar, the CEO of Cirque du Soleil, mentioned that as long as their shows are roughly at a 50% capacity, then they can turn a profit. So the bar is roughly low, but as long as audiences can come in. So now they have no revenue coming in. They've got these 5,000 employees. 95% of them have been laid off. The only way basically to keep the company afloat was to ask the investors, so TPG, Fosun, and the Caisse de Dépôt, to reinject funds, cash flow, to keep the company afloat, a few months. And I'm truly hoping that, I think it would be the logical thing at this point, that the governments will also follow through, not just yes to help out Cirque du Soleil, but also the other companies that do not have access to those funds. These are thousands of jobs, and also think of the symbolic capital. So we claim to have reinvented circus. 40 years we've created this new, basically national creative branding. What are we known for? We're known for Céline Dion, Robert Lepage, Cirque du Soleil. So our creativity, our know-how, our technical know-how, and our entrepreneurship. 40 years of building this, are we just going to let this fall? That doesn't make any sense. I think nationally, like provincially, but also nationally across the country. And this is one piece of a very larger whole. So in summary, I think that 50 million that was injected was absolutely essential, and it's a sign that the investors are taking this seriously. And now the government should follow up as well with very concrete plans. So how do you support freelance artists? They're not salaried, right? So you have to find ways to be creative about that. How do you invest in infrastructure as well? Because we've got 2 companies outside of Cirque du Soleil, Seven Fingers and Cirque-Étoile, that have buildings, have new buildings that we have collectively invested in. And I wouldn't want to see these companies basically be swallowed by this incredible debt. But what we're seeing, interestingly, is that this virus is hitting us collectively where we are weak. Great reliance on a single source of revenue, reliance on external capitalization, just looking at Cirque du Soleil, for instance, but also just generally the live arts. And our structural flaws are made apparent right away, as we've seen every day in the news with the CHSLDs and even within Concordia. Like, wherever there are weaknesses, they're now, over the past month, made absolutely manifest.
Thank you for this. I'd like to invite the audience to send us questions. We received some already, but as we continue, we have about less than 15, actually 10 minutes to continue. I'd like to open the floor to the 4 panelists and ask them, in your opinion, can we learn something from the other countries so far who have gone through this prior to us? With the déconfinement, what they have done, the way they're trying to work with the economy and so on. Are there some lessons to be learned so far, or is it too early maybe? So I'd like to get your opinion on that. Who wants to start? Patrick, do you want to start?
I think Moshe had his hand up. Go ahead, please.
Sorry, please. Yes, Moshe. My apologies.
Yeah. So I'll see if I can maybe start by giving something that everybody can probably agree on here. Stephen made mention of it as well. You know, from an economic standpoint, one of the things that we talk about is that whenever individuals or businesses or governments are out there trying to make decisions, information is critical. The more information you have, the better decisions that you can make. And where we view as economists that society is made up of a bunch of individuals walking around trying to maximize their happiness in life, or businesses are walking around trying to maximize their profits, or governments trying to maximize the well-being of society, the role of information is key. And so I think that, you know, if you go back 20 years and you look at SARS and how that unfolded, one of the things the Chinese government was heavily criticized for was their lack of information, or worse, misinformation and disinformation that was being provided, where they were trying to kind of cover up the extent of their negligence in dealing with it, which made it all the more difficult. China has been maybe a little more forthcoming this time around, but I think that what we've seen is that countries that have been transparent, countries that have been willing to provide that information, have also seen that curve flatten faster. It makes it a lot easier for individuals to decide whether they do need to quarantine, self-isolate, what steps they can take to make sure that this doesn't become a much greater problem than what it is. In economies that have been slow to inform people, or where they presented a political bias slant to the way that they want to disseminate information, this is where we've seen things have gone badly or been slow to correct. The other part, which Stephen also mentioned, which economists would clearly agree to, is that idea of trust. Is that, you know, if the information that you're putting out there is not trustworthy, then it's almost worse than no information at all. So I think that one of the lessons that we can take from this is that where we saw countries that were quick to come out and say, this is the extent of it, we're going to have regular updates, we're going to provide you with exact information about who has it, where they have it, where they've been coming from, how they've acquired it, who's it's been spread to. They've also been the ones that look like they're at the readiest state to reopen. Economies that have great degrees of trust in their government, in their leaders, in their media to provide accurate information and timely information, they're also the ones that are showing the fastest to come out. First country that comes to mind is New Zealand, where in the aftermath of the terrible shooting a couple of years ago, the fact that the government came forward so quickly and was so transparent about what happened, how to deal with it, and what they're going to take going forward, it's also put a lot of trust in the government now that the economy is ready to kind of just come out almost back to normal because of the role that information has played. So I'll leave it to my colleagues to agree, disagree, or contribute.
Yes, and you use a word that Stephen has mentioned many times, which is trustworthy, using the information properly and sharing this properly and so on. So Stephen, so far, what are the lessons we can learn from a leadership perspective by observing the other leaders and our own leaders?
Well, I think COVID is more than an economic and a medical issue. I think it's now a psychological issue for many people because of the uncertainty of everything. So let's go back to what Moshe said about something I had commented on trust. Trust is really an expectation that somebody, a leader, will not act opportunistically at your expense. And it's really founded upon things like, do they have integrity? Are they competent? Loyalty, are they open with you? Are you getting all the information? So in times like this, you really need data. And when we look at research that was even from 1960s and 70s, when organizational behavior was just in its infancy, leaders were perceived as being effective the more that they communicated to people exactly what was going on. Most people know what's going on. And the question is, can they correlate that with whoever's running the business, or who's running the province, or who's running the US, or governors and states? can they look at that and say, I really got a straight answer and things are not good, but at least I know where they are? Because if I don't get that, then what happens is I start fantasizing, and generally that goes negative. And I think that that's the most critical issue right now in terms of this, in terms of economic contagion. Because I think once that happens, if we continue along this route of watching every day, it seems like I keep looking at what's going on in the US with the president, but it's a reality show. It's like watching The Apprentice. It's not real. And when you don't get answers that are not real, you then make them up. And what we often do is we go to the negative side. Well, if we're not getting information, it really must be terrible. Well, maybe it's not as terrible if we start contrasting, looking at the number of cases, the number of deaths, looking at the statistics, what's the standard deviation here, and so on and so forth. And it might be getting better, but when we don't get that, then we really go to the dark side. And I think that's the real issue. And then that affects the economics. And then that affects everything else. So the psychological dynamics is not just mental health. It's basically, how does it drive our behavior? And that's what's critical here. And I think that's the piece that's missing right now in the leadership. Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, seems to have gotten it right. And I think that that model is something that we really ought to be looking at in terms of how do we treat the citizens of a country or the employees of an organization.
Do you want to say more about her actual approach, what she has done that makes you say that? It seems to be a very good model.
She's done all the things that I listed, what good leaders do.
So to check
you don't want me to go back over that again, Anne-Marie.
That's fine, absolutely. Patrick, do you want to say more about the economic transformation post-COVID?
I was thinking about comments from my colleagues about leadership, and in Quebec we've had an interesting relationship with our premier, who every day speaks to us directly. It's a very non-politician, no nonsense, addressing us as human beings. It's obviously it's a mediated presence, but it doesn't feel like it. And I'd say for the most part, people were extremely interested in hearing what he had to say, because he seemed absolutely truthful, authentic. So you could have social cohesion because there seemed to be a coherent plan. Over the last few days, I guess, we're starting to doubt because we're starting to find things out. And he seems to be, as soon as he started politicking a tiny bit, our ears perked up, and we immediately thought of that other fellow south of the border who I avoid. I try not to see what's going on there, because I'm interested in the truth, and I'm interested in actually what we can do as a society. But there's something interesting in the performance of leadership, the performance of that authority that I think we'll have to look into over the next few weeks. How do our leaders perform? How do they make us feel confident in the future? And economics rely on that sense of confidence.
It does indeed, and it seems that the more they come across trustworthy, telling us what they know and what they don't know, I think it helps us to say, okay, it's not they're hiding something. It seems that if I take Steve's advice, is that if you're not direct enough, even if you don't know, but you say that you don't know already, you come across as a better leader than if you're trying to hide things, right? To avoid people going on the negative side. Matthäus, you want to add something?
Yes, just talking about the performance of these daily press conferences and performance of leadership. One critical aspect of this performance are also the numbers. And for me as an accountant, they also do something. They are performative, and we have to be mindful how they're used, how they are changed in their presentation. And I think, Moshe, you mentioned per capita Canada is not bad. We're just 4,000. They're only 4,000. But then what do they also do? They say, okay, now it's not a Canada problem, it's a problem of Quebec. Well, in Quebec, it's not a problem of Quebec, it's a problem of the greater Montreal Island. And now we're at the state where we say it's not a problem of the island, it's a problem of the CHSLD. So you see what the numbers also can do. They are performing, and they are a big part of this daily routine now of presenting numbers. And as an accountant, I'm always fascinated by what do we do with numbers, how we present it. So we have to be aware these are tricky, hopefully not trappy numbers.
I hear an idea for an article there.
I do. And Matthäus was on conversation, so that's just very good. It's already noon. We had another list of questions, but we have no more time for these questions. Again, I'd like to thank our colleagues, Moshe, Stephen, Matthäus. It's been a pleasure. And Anna, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you on behalf of us for space, the panelists, our excellent moderator, all of the attendees. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for your time, the energy, and incredible insights. I will probably share the leftover questions with you just to give you an idea of what people are thinking about as they were listening to your kind of insights. So we invite you also to check out the kind of weekly conversations that we host at Fourspace, fun workshops as well, and other activities as part of the See You at Home initiative. Please check us out at concordia.ca/4 or on social media, See You at Fourspace. And with that, I am conscious of the time and thank everyone for being here. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks
Thank you all. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun. Thank you.